Hello and welcome to this video about the British Empire. All of the information and knowledge in this video is from a book called The Lion's Share by Bernard Porter. I would recommend using this video, or you can use it as a video by looking at the slides because all of the notes will be on the slides, or if you prefer, you could just listen to it as an audio podcast, whatever is easiest for you. So, as I say, this book is being based on Bernard Porter's The Lion's Share. So in terms of the preface of the book, Porter acknowledges that actually the British Empire was a sign of weakness for Britain. This seems a bit strange, this idea. He argues that actually there was this period before Britain developed a huge empire that actually Britain was in a stronger position because Britain could simply trade and operate across the world without having to formally colonize places. So actually, when Britain later on faces this European competition, Britain is forced to expand its empire. So one of the key ideas in Porter's book is that actually when Britain grew its empire, let's say by the 1920s, when Britain had this huge empire, it doesn't actually mean that Britain was stronger at that point. Britain, Porter argues, was actually stronger in the 1850s when its empire was much, much smaller. That idea will become clearer as we go through the book. He also looks at the definition of empire, and he's saying his definition of empire is quite broad. He says that empire was not just about colonies, places that were officially part of the British Empire. He also includes this idea of informal empire and cultural imperialism. Now, informal empire is the idea that there were parts of the world that were not part of the British Empire, but were largely influenced by Britain. So there's this idea of formal empire, which is places that were officially part of the British Empire, and informal empire, these places that were influenced by Britain that were not officially part of the British Empire. He talks about the idea that dominions, these were the white settler colonies such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada. He calls them dominions, and they were not technically ruled by the British government in London from the late 19th century. So in the introduction, he is very clear that British imperialism varied a lot. There was no kind of set clear rule of what British imperialism should look like. It really was quite different in lots of different places. He talks about how the definitions are very complex. So for example, empire would refer to like formal British colonies, but the idea of imperialism is much more broad. Imperialism could include trade, informal empire, ideology. The idea of imperialism he talks about is the idea that there's an unfair relationship between two countries. Imperialism and imperial power are very hard to measure, so this is quite a complex thing to define. But he says that imperialism can include trade arrangements. For example, when Britain was trading with other parts of the world in this period, because Britain was always in a much more dominant position, as Britain was so much more powerful than most countries in the world, especially as we're talking about the 1850s. So he also talks about this idea that there was not a complete clear agreement amongst Britons in this period. So for example, sometimes you got the British government in London who had huge disagreements with British businessmen about how empire should be run. So it's this idea that's very complex. Not everyone agreed on exactly what empire should look like. He talks about the idea that the British strength was actually more economic than military. It's true that Britain didn't really ever have a really strong standing army, and although Britain had a strong navy, his idea is that strength really came from its economic strength, not its military. He wants you to be clear that we're not just talking about the British government here, we're also talking about British individuals, for example, business owners, people who are running private companies. And the reasons for empire are material, so that's essentially about making money, but there's also this idea of spreading British culture and ideology. In terms of what's going on in Britain itself, Porter does say that an imperial culture in Britain did emerge, but he says this was incidental and it did not actually guide imperialism. And going back to this idea of the complexity, he says that imperialism was heterogeneous and inconsistent, so very, very varied. And in terms of how empire developed and how it emerged in Britain and across the world, there was no clear and consistent ideology of empire. It varied a lot. and in some cases was quite random. So chapter 1. He says an empire in all but name, the mid-19th century. So what he's saying here is that Britain doesn't look like it's got a huge empire. If you were to look at a map of the British Empire in the 1850s, not very big. He's saying that, however, Britain pretty much did have an empire because it had so much influence across the world. So he's talking about empire's logic. Well, it's all about Britain's economic, political, and cultural predominance. Mercantilism in this period was not free trade. So in this period, Britain is moving away from this idea of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that Britain, with its colonies, is going to control exactly who its colonies can and can't trade with, and Britain is going to have lots of control over its colonies and their trade. In this period, Britain is moving away from that idea, and it's moving towards something called free trade, which is the idea that Britain is not going to control its colonies in terms of their trading arrangements. It's going to be their free decision who they don't trade with. At this period, Britain has had its industrial revolution. So from about 1750 onwards, Britain has had an industrial revolution. Britain in its factories is producing loads and loads of materials and goods that are being shipped across the world. And for this, Britain needed raw materials. So for example, for its textiles industry, Britain needs cotton. They also need markets. They need people and countries to sell these goods to, because they can't just sell it to people in Britain. They can't just sell it to Europe. They want to sell it to lots of countries across the world. And Britain, because of its industrial strength in this period, is known as the workshop of the world. So Britain is producing manufactured goods in its factories, and often it's not necessarily money that's being exchanged when these goods are being sold. It's often they're just swapping materials. So what would often happen is Britain is getting raw materials from other parts of the world and food, and they're swapping that for British manufactured goods. Now, Britain at this time, agriculture is not a key part of Britain's economy. As we say, manufacturing and industry are the key parts of Britain's economy. Britain is reliant on imports for food. So Britain is getting most of its food from abroad. Porter talks about this idea of ties of dependency on both sides. So it's this idea that both sides are kind of reliant on one another for trade. And he does talk about this idea that Britain, in terms of British people, this was an underexploited domestic market. So actually, Britain, had Britain wanted to, Britain could have sold more of the goods it was producing to British people themselves. However, Porter argues that actually lots of British people were actually not wealthy enough. So maybe had Britain followed a policy which meant that British people were wealthier, they could have been able to sell some of these British goods to actual British people. In terms of Britain's economy, so Britain has this huge manufacturing part of its economy, but also Britain has really successful service industries such as insurance in this period. So London is becoming a dominant global city with all of these service industries. Insurance would be a classic example. Banking, we can also talk about as well. So as we know, the British government would lead in terms of imperialism, but it's not always being pushed by government. There are also commercial men pushing this, and it's not always like a clear government policy of what's going on. It's slightly more random. Interestingly, when British individuals were investing abroad in another country, say they were putting their money, say in Asia, sometimes the British government would offer them protection. So they would say, look, if something goes wrong, we will back you up. But in some cases, the British government was saying, no, if you want to go and invest your money in another part of the world, that's your decision, that's your risk. We will not protect your investment. Britain wanted to expand commerce for all. So Britain is saying in this period, we want everyone to be trading. We want the whole world to be trading. And Britain was very relaxed about that because Britain was the dominant power, especially when we talk about in Europe, North America. There were no other countries that came close to Britain. So Britain was in a very relaxed position. They were basically saying, look, we're not going to force countries to trade with us, but we're just going to go and create these trade deals with them, and we're going to call it free trade. And actually, this should help the whole global economy. And in some places, the British do go in and they're completely changing what is grown, what is produced. So, for example, the British introduced coffee into Ceylon in this period, and Ceylon is modern-day Sri Lanka. In this period, we get lots of emigration from Britain to empire. So we're thinking of places like Canada, Australia would be good examples of that, New Zealand as well. So the British have got this technology, the railways, the railroads, and in this period, other parts of the world are building railways. Now, often these countries didn't have enough money to build it themselves, so they would ask to borrow money from British banks. So often the finance is coming from British banks, and therefore, when these railways are being built across the world, even in parts of the world that are not part of the British Empire, British businesses, British banks are also profiting. We talk about this idea of free trade, and Britain was very relaxed about free trade. And they said, look, this is the fairest way of doing it. No one's going to be exploited. Everyone's going to have freedom to kind of strike these trade deals. But Porter argues that this was not always completely free and fair. And because Britain, in many cases, was actually very dominant in these trade negotiations. And it's important to know that these places, lots of parts of the world, even places that were not part of the British Empire, were reliant on British London capitals. So they're borrowing money from Britain. And if they don't have this money coming in from Britain, these countries, their economies would suffer a lot. So look, City of London, London is a key part of the global economy. But it's really important that we know in the 1840s and the 1850s, the British Foreign Office, so based in London, part of the government dealing with other parts of the world, they did not want Britain to expand its empire. Britain didn't need an empire in this period. They were very, very happy to just operate across the world, trading, giving money, lending money. Britain did not need to officially take control of these countries because that actually, in some cases, can cost a lot of money and it's a lot of hassle. So the British Foreign Office is saying, we don't want to grow our empire. Let's keep it how it is. Now, the British tried to expand their influence in China, but there was resistance to this from the Chinese authorities there. In Africa, the British believed there needed to be some European control to allow for secure commerce. Now, remember, the British don't want to, in this period, they don't want to colonize and make large parts of Africa part of the British Empire because too much hassle. They want to just simply trade there. However, in order to trade there, they need to have some control to make sure that the trade is safe, to make sure that it's reliable. So they are saying, okay, we will have some control, but only where we need it. In East Africa, there's very little British trade in this period. And this is the key point again. The British do not want political control over other parts of the world. They do not want large parts of the world to become part of the British Empire. They just simply want to trade and make money from this trade. Now, so political control was not the aim, but if, for example, they want to trade with an area, let's say, for example, parts of West Africa, and the local rulers there are not negotiating with the British, the local rulers, there's no stability there. The British feel like, oh, if they're trading there, it's not necessarily going to be safe. Their investments won't be safe. The British will simply go in and they will make those places part of the British Empire. But this was only really a last resort. So in this period, we're talking about a couple of types of empire. We've got the old empire. So this is the empire, parts of empire that Britain's kind of had for the last 100 years or so. And that includes Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Now, these parts of old empire were mainly settler colonies. So they had significant white populations there. And these are just people who have moved from the British Isles to empire. We call these the settler colonies, later known as the Dominions. But it's important to know in the 1850s, there was a debate about the future of the empire. People were critical of this mercantilist empire, remember, which goes against the idea of free trade. And there are people, for example, Richard Cobden, who is against the acquisition of colonies. People like Cobden are saying, we do not need to expand our empire. We just need to trade across the world, and free trade is all we need. We do not need to expand our empire. But then there's also other people saying, well, if we want to trade with other parts of the world, we actually need to have formal control of these areas to make it safer, to make it more stable. because you don't want to go and trade in some part of the world where there's no stability, where we don't trust the leaders. These people are saying, no, actually, we do need colonies. We do need to expand that empire to make trade and commerce more stable. India. India at this point in the 1850s is not ruled by the British government per se. It's ruled by a private British company called the East India Company. India was a huge market for cotton. So Britain is getting lots of cotton, raw cotton from India. So in 1850, 1/5 of Britain's cotton goods, such as textiles, went to India. So simply, this is what's happening. Britain is taking raw cotton that literally grows from India. They're shipping it back to Britain. It's being taken to British factories, and then the British factories are then producing that into a manufactured good, which is textiles. Textiles would be like clothing, bed sheets, tablecloths, etc. And then they're then taking them and selling them back to India, and they're making profit because they're buying the cotton cheap and then they're selling the textiles for an expensive price. Canada is a good example of this debate. People were saying, well, Britain's got this colony, Canada, and people were saying, let's just let it go. We don't want it to be part of the British Empire. There was this debate. So what the British are doing in this period as well is they are starting to give more freedom to certain colonies. For example, Australia, Canada, the white settler colonies. So these are places where there was a significant white population. The British were giving responsible government, which basically means they're allowing the settlers there to have control of certain issues. So, for example, education, health, small local issues are being decided by people, the settlers, in their own parliaments. The big, wider issues, such as foreign policy, are still being controlled by the British, and the British will still have responsibility for defending these colonies, but they are giving these colonies certain amounts of freedom. And the simple idea for the British, from the British perspective, is, well, they saw these people were white. They said, okay, according to kind of Britain's racist racial theory at the time, these people were seen to be responsible enough to rule themselves. However, there's no responsible government in other parts of the world. So, for example, in the West Indies, where Britain has several colonies, there were not enough powerful white settlers. So the British simply say, we're not going to give them responsible government because the black population is the majority. And according to British racial theory, they can't be trusted to have responsible government now. So basically, this is a general rule. When there was a significant white population, the British were prepared to give self-government away. Now, we talked about India. India at this point was not fully ruled by the British government. It was ruled by this British private company. However, there's a huge rebellion in 1857 going into 1858 called the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion. And the British government in this period believe they have to take control of India to avoid the disintegration of the country. So the EIC, the East India Company, had controlled India, and they'd made changes to improve commercial efficiency, such as introducing English land ownership system in Bengal. The EIC had also followed a policy of Europeanization to make Indians like Europeans. So, for example, the British, this is also called Westernization. The British had a policy before 1857. They were trying to say, we don't necessarily love Indian culture. We don't necessarily completely respect Indian culture. We believe this country would be so much better if they were just like British people. And that was a policy of Westernization. For example, they'd allowed Christian missionaries to operate. They were really trying to educate Indians so that they become like British people. And what they'd done is they'd created an Indian middle class who were pro-English. In the 1830s to 1850s, the EIC had also made changes to land, tax, civil laws, administration, and higher education. Now, quite simply, the British made profit from their role in India by selling things to Indians. For this, the British needed them to be civilized. So, for example, if the majority of Indian people were peasants who had very few material goods, then the British can't sell them stuff. However, if the British can, I say this quote unquote, civilize these people so that they are kind of have different wants and needs, the British can then sell them things. For example, an Indian peasant family might just need one tablecloth. They don't need to keep buying British textiles. However, if the British are starting to say, no, actually you need the latest fashion and tablecloths, you need 2 or 3 tablecloths, that is going to be good for Britain. So it's within Britain's interests to change the culture of Indian society, so the British can make more money by selling these people things. We talked about the white settler colonies such as Australia. Although they were given this self-government, they still needed British military protection. Australia at this point was in no way it was in a position to protect itself. So there is this debate. Well, these colonies have got their self-government, and they're still very much reliant on Britain. Some people are saying, oh, this is a waste of British resources. And obviously the Navy is key for this. British Army is never particularly strong in this period. Britain in this period does never really has a dominant army. The Navy and the control of the sea is so key to British policy. In terms of what's going on in its colonies, especially colonies where there's a significant non-white population, and actually, to be fair, when there is just in all colonies, the British government have this difficult question of how they're going to protect the native indigenous people from white settlers. As a general rule in this course, the British government wanted to treat the native people better, whereas the white settlers, let's say usually business owners, were more prepared to exploit the local populations. And there was this tension that's created between the settlers and the British government in this period. In this period, there's also this idea of Christianity, missionaries, and commerce were all closely linked. These ideas tied in with evolutionary anthropology and that European civilization was the highest form. So look, this is a key idea in this period. Europeans, there's a lot of ideas and pseudo-scientific ideas going around that talk about the idea that European civilization was superior to other civilizations, and that it was the role of Europeans to go and to civilize, quote unquote, other parts of the world. Now, Christian missionaries are people who leave Britain and they literally go out and they're trying to make as many non-Christian people Christian. And also in doing this, though, they're also trying to help trade and commerce in this process. And there were, thousands of mission schools set up across empire and non-empire as well to try and convert people to Christianity. Now, once again, these missionaries, they did not always help the British government. So there's this conflict between missionaries and the British government. They did not always work together, and sometimes they were seen to be interfering in colonies. We talked about this conflict between the white settlers and the British government. There was always this idea, for example, white planters, let's say in the West Indies, they wanted the locals to work more, and they were saying to the British government, these people, we need to work them more, we need to increase our profits. And the British government was saying, no, you have certain restrictions, you can't just kind of basically treat these people as they're enslaved people. And there is this conflict that emerges there. That is the end of this first video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.